Hi, it's mental health counselor Dr. Greg Jantz. We have been in a season of trauma. How to Triumph Over Trauma just happens to be the title of my newest book, Triumph Over Trauma. Today is part 2 of Triumph Over Trauma.
Dr. Gregory Jantz is a best-selling author of over 45 books and the founder of the Center A Place of Hope, voted a top 10 center for depression treatment in the U.S. As the pioneer of whole person care, Dr. Jantz is known as the messenger of hope. Now the nation's expert on anxiety, depression, substance abuse, relationships, trauma, and PTSD, here is Dr. Gregory Jantz.
Trauma is that funny word. It's an uncomfortable word, and we say trauma. A lot of times there's images. Could be in images of something like an automobile accident. You think of trauma, first responders. The definition of trauma at times is confusing, but we know that trauma is anything, one-time event, multiple events. It is something that brings great emotional pain that is overwhelming that we typically don't recover from, and it has whole person implications in our emotional health, in our physical health, in our immune health. It has implications on even what we may believe spiritually. Certainly can have implications in relationships. We pull away from relationships, or we don't have appropriate boundaries in relationships. So trauma. And today is really part 2 from my book, Triumph Over Trauma. And this is something that I was actually doing during the kind of the middle of the pandemic, whenever that started. And the question is it over? I don't know. But trauma is something that everybody was experiencing because we had something called anticipatory anxiety. It was what's going to happen next, and that chronic anxiety stayed with folks and still stays with individuals and affects us, and we get, the word is triggered by, if we had past trauma, things that are happening today that have broken trust, recreate trauma, recreate images. And so this is a timely topic, and I just want to say here in part 2, there are 10 significant truths to trauma. Number 1, and this is a overview, but we need to know that trauma does come in all sizes, all shapes, and people experience trauma differently. A vet who may had many exposures to traumatic events and gets diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder has experienced trauma differently than a person who perhaps was a victim, let's say, of domestic violence, and yet both of those are traumatic events. Both of those affect the person. And so think of trauma not so much in degrees, but that we all have a different capacity for dealing with things that are traumatic. And if they're not dealt with, this is what we see can create the post-traumatic stress disorder, create the future issues. And so comes in all shapes and sizes. And we also know that trauma is long lasting if it's not dealt with. The effects of it, it'll affect us socially, physically, as I've mentioned. It'll affect us spiritually, things we believe. So trauma has a whole person effect. And I want to say here, it's always real. And if you've had trauma, it's not a sign in any way that you are a failure. Trauma can cause you to feel shameful. Shamefulness is, I've had something happen to me and I no longer feel good about myself. I may even feel like I deserved it. That's what the lie of shame does in a person's life. And here's another point that's so important of our just 10 myths, if you will, is that time alone doesn't heal. We have got to look at an action plan. I always say hope comes when there's a plan, and trauma requires a plan. And we want to look at, okay, time alone doesn't heal, but what do I need to do? And I also, related to that, I have on my list that there are no shortcuts. Trauma does not You can't have a shortcut. There are things that can be helpful. There are newer tools. There is EMDR, which this is not about that, but there are ways that we can help process trauma, but there's not a shortcut to recovery. So, and here's probably my most important point. No matter how much traumatic events have pushed you in a direction you thought your life would never go, pushed you in a direction of addiction or unhealthy relationships, wherever you find yourself, trauma does not have to be a life sentence. There's always a way back. Now, my faith beliefs is that God can help us and does help us find a way back. And I believe we can become stronger. We can become even bolder in our recovery, and we can be an instrument to help others. And one of the blocks with trauma is, it's so painful, I can't do it, I can't go through this. And that's what it feels like. It feels like I can never, ever go through this again. And we develop a fear of the fear itself, and so it never really gets addressed, and maybe we drink our way through all the traumatic feelings, and we drink our way through the emotions that are so overwhelming. We look for a way. It doesn't necessarily have to be alcohol. It could be food, could be drugs, it could be anything that mood elevates, changes how we feel. So trauma, unresolved, causes us to seek some way to lessen the pain. Now, here's what we know. Traumatic events can affect us, and this is the prefrontal cortex. This is where we call it our wise brain or our wise decisions. And the prefrontal cortex, in a way, gets a bit short-circuited, and it's hard to make good decisions when I've been a victim of repeated trauma. Now, let me add, you can also be a witness to repeated trauma, and it will have a very, very similar effect. Those images, the experience, the emotion of being a witness to trauma. So you don't necessarily have to be the one that is receiving the trauma, because trauma, the experience of even viewing trauma has the same effect. Okay, there's a term now that psychologists are using more, and it's called foreshortened future. And it's a loss of hope. It's where you really have limited expectations that life will be any different. You have limited expectations for the future, and you just don't believe that it's going to be any hope at all, or to be any better. And so we see our life foreshortened because we don't have hope for the future. So this is some of the things that walking through trauma can do, or when you don't walk through it, I should say. But walking through trauma, which is what Triumph Over Trauma is all about. In fact, we created even a wonderful workbook that goes along with this. The workbook. Here it is. Yeah, the workbook that goes along with Triumph Over Trauma, because we've got to engage. This is, you've got to engage with the information. We've got to get a involvement and an action plan. Remember, hope comes when there's a plan. That's why we created the Triumph Over Trauma workbook, because honestly, if you've had a lot of trauma, just reading this can feel like, okay, I get all this. Where do I go from here? What do I do? And we've got to take it to another level, engage with the material, dive in, face some things, work through some things. Usually we're working through some of this with a trusted counselor that is exceptional in the area of trauma. Okay. Now, the traumatized brain cannot tell the difference between the past and present. It feels the same. You had significant trauma in the past, and now what you're experiencing is a trigger. You see something that reminds you of what happened in the past, or maybe there was something that you saw, you go, oh, and it reactivated those memories. The brain, it's all the same to the brain. That's what trauma does. We do have something, we become what I call hyper-vigilant, hypersensitive, hyper-vigilant, hyper-aware, and we easily can misinterpret. Somebody could say something and we're hyper-vigilant, we misinterpret it, we take it as let's say, a personal attack, we misprocess that information, it feels traumatic, we perhaps had a misunderstanding, we believe it was true, and there you go. It is telling the brain this is a traumatic experience. And so that's what we mean by a trigger. Hypervigilant, that's one of the things it does. I made a note here that our amygdala, that part of the brain, more primitive part of the brain, it's the danger and alarm, fight or flight. If you've had a lot of trauma, that fight or flight, what we mean by that is I had something traumatic, I either run from it, I'm running from it, getting away from it, or I stay there, I'm fighting the trauma. We're wired to do one or the others, but if we're overwhelmed with the trauma, we don't really activate fight or flight. And we can't activate that good prefrontal cortex thinking either. And so it's hard for us, unless we learn it, it's hard for us to develop resilience. And resilience means I have the ability to walk through this pain. I have the ability to grow. I have the ability not only to grow, but I will grow stronger. I have the ability to deal with things that may at first seem overwhelming. Because I am strengthened, I've become more resilient. Here's some things to look for to make sure these will rob you of the resilience. And I have a pretty good list. Abusive drugs or alcohol. If you stay in a depression, a clinical depression, that will do it. If you have ongoing panic attacks, and panic attacks are those attacks that sneak up on you and feel totally overwhelming, and fear paralyzes you, that will do it. If you find that you have intense rage and emotional outburst, feelings of intense anger, okay, this is all, again, a sign that I'm not able to be resilient because my emotions are driving me versus having any sense of control over those emotions. And those intense feelings, let me just say, yeah, they're understandable. Yeah, they're justifiable. And they are very intense. But what we know is that intensity overrides this prefrontal cortex. We can't seem to make a decision. And we may try, here's another one on the list, we try to repress, hold this down, hold all those bad memories down. I'll just put a lid on it. I'll never touch those memories. When in fact, I have to look at them to recover. But repressed memories cause me then I would try to repress them. It causes other things to leak, so to speak. All right, emotional detachment. I can't seem to attach in a healthy way to other people. I can't seem to bond. I have an emotional detachment. I keep myself safe. I never get close to anybody. And that's what trauma does. And that's a sign of not living in resilience. Obviously, a loss of self-esteem, self-value, that shame that says, you're ruined, there's nothing good about me. That's that sense of shame. We also know, and this can be a confusing word, but there can be disassociations. And disassociations mean that things can be so intense, either through a memory or through the experience, that I really do disconnect from reality and I put myself in a different reality. It's so overwhelming, there's no place for my senses. And so I am experiencing trauma, but I put myself on the beach. I totally disconnect. And I learn how to disconnect from reality as a part of coping with intense trauma. We know that there's suicide thinking, suicide ideation. A lot of times, if there's been repeated trauma, I can feel like it's not even worth it living. And so I want to disconnect from life. I want to disconnect from living. And we know that suicide attempts for a person that's traumatized or has post-traumatic stress disorder, deep depression, is not uncommon. We want to get help way before we get to that point, but it's not that uncommon. We also know that the inability to concentrate, the inability to make simple decisions, that's a sign I'm not living in resilience. And we also know that constant irritability and moodiness, where you feel like I'm always irritable, and you can't seem to change that. We know that there is a withdrawal from others, and this withdrawal from others just means I don't want to be around people, too much energy, I don't trust anybody, and so I pull away. So these are some of the signs or symptoms that I'm not living in resilience. And it does feel like, and there are physiological effects of trauma. It does feel like, and I've had many clients in the past say, it feels like I am losing my mind. That's exactly what it feels like. And there is something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I know that was a lot. Hypothalamic adrenal pituitary axis. And trauma physiologically disrupts that gland relationship in the body system, and it affects our nervous system. And so that's where I want you to know there really are physiological effects of trauma. There really are reasons why. I just went through that list of things that you could be experiencing. That's there's a physiological reason why those mental issues emerge, because that is unresolved trauma. And I haven't mentioned it, but eating disorders is another can emerge as a result of trauma. Almost everyone, I can't make a total generalization, but have experienced anorexia, bulimia. My early part of my career, my very first book I wrote was called Hope, Help, and Healing for Eating Disorders. This was very significant as we look at a whole person model to treat eating disorders. And it didn't always have to be a physical or sexual trauma. We saw with eating disorders, almost universally, everybody could relate to emotional trauma. Hence, the following book was Healing the Scars of Emotional Abuse, because emotional abuse is traumatic. Trauma etches away at that sense of self that we have. Okay, here's a few thoughts. Anchor your trauma in the past. Okay, keep it in the past. This is just a simple way to look at this, but in the book Triumph Over Trauma, I obviously go into more detail on these. But our brain does have a hard time knowing the past from the present, remember? And so I'm going, if maybe it's by a journal, I'm going to be logging the trauma and referencing that trauma to the point of time that it occurred. This occurred when I was 6 to 10 years old. I am going to work on containing saying that trauma belongs in the past. And there's ways that you can journal that help anchor those memories to the right time frame. Trauma has a way of, if you will, rippling out or bleeding over. That's that past and present, and we can't seem to step out of that past. So I'm just saying we're going to start to work on ways to contain, first of all, the memories to what time zone they belong. And there's ways that I talk about that you can write this that keeps framing it in the past. But one of the things this does is it helps us to start deactivating the fear center of our brain, and helps us to have more present day decision making. It helps turn on this prefrontal cortex. This is really where we make our, this is what we say, the wise brain. It's where we make our good decisions, or we're supposed to. If I'm using that part of my brain, I tend not to be as impulsive. I'm not acting out. I'm channeling things through my wise or rational brain, the prefrontal cortex. Again, just one simple thing that we can do is always put it in the right time frame. And you need to remember that when you write about it and log it in those time frames, it's not about you taking responsibility for it. It is really about, this was done to me. This is what I experienced by them, whoever them was. And this happened to me during this time frame. And even making a reference point, this was traumatic and this was abusive. Framing it properly and framing time frames is really important to do that. That's just one little step to take. Lots of, particularly as you get into the workbook, lots of, and this is really intended to be done over 12 weeks. So, and really as good as the resources are, this I always suggest, if you've had trauma, work through this with somebody. This is not a time to do this alone and think it's going to solve everything. That's not what it's about. You've got to, we'll tend to want to avoid, or we'll tend to want to go too fast through it. This is why, just for our emotional well-being, do this, work through Triumph Over Trauma, the workbook, do it with somebody who can really walk with you, because I am asking you to dig deeper and deeper. And, week 1 is entitled The Truth Will Set You Free. And we got to deal with the truth and what it did to us. And then you'll see there's lots of questions. I've got to engage with those questions. And sometimes even writing something down, there's something about, that's why I say, don't use a keyboard. You're writing it down. You're putting it in your own writing. I don't want you just to think it. I want you, we call it, don't just think it, ink it. I want you to write it down. So this is so important that we do this and begin to deal that first step with the truth will set you free. And it's, I hate to use the word journey, but it is a journey. You got to have a starting point, and there's a midpoint. There may be a future working through some things where you feel like the endpoint's not real clear, but hey, I know I'm 90% there. I'm not where I was before. And then there's just that sense. And I know, and my personal belief is that things that were intended, or things that happened to us that really were evil or intended to be evil, my faith belief is that God can turn around things that were intended for evil and use them for great good. I just say that because not only do I believe it, and I believe it because I've seen this in people's lives over and over and over, who have chosen to go through and walk through trauma and have that triumph, that this is a place where you can move through and feel a sense of recovery that you haven't ever felt before. Okay, there's more to go, but you know what? Our brain space can only do so much when there's trauma, and our brain space can only really tolerate so much on the topic at a time. So we're going to do this in steps. All right. But I do want to say, remember, hope comes when there's a plan. We are creating a plan for dealing with trauma.